Morning everyone, welcome to the local review body of the month of August. My name is Councillor Henry Anderson, I'm the convener of the LRB. With me this morning is Councillor Callum Purvis and Councillor Tom Gray, and acting as substitute is Councillor Willie Wilson. Also with us is Mr Harrison, a planning advisor to the LRB, who is not part of the planning department and has no previous involvement in any of the applications we have with us before us today. We have our legal advisor, Mr Colin Elliott, and also we have Mr Williams from Committee Services. Before we commence the business of the day, can I inform you that today's meeting will be recorded and will be available on the Council's website. Can I ask that all electronic devices is muted, and can I ask if there is any declarations of interest by members on today's agenda?
Councillor Gray, I would like to declare an interest on item 1, which is the one Gleneagles Estate.
Thank you. Thank you. So we'll get Councillor Wilson will substitute for the first item that's on the agenda today.
Convener, could I interrupt? Sorry.
Yeah.
Could I ask Councillor Gray, is that a financial or a non-financial interest?
There's a non-financial interest.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to confirm, convener, I'm in the room.
You're in the room. Thank you. Can we note the minute of the last meeting, July's meeting of the LRB?
Agreed.
Noted.
Thank you. Now, can I move on to the first item for today, which is, well, I'll hand over to I'll hand over to Mr Harrison whilst I find the paperwork for it. Thank you.
Thank you, convener. By way of introduction, as you say, this is a planning application in principle for the erection of a dwelling house at land 70 metres north of Vargate Cottage, Gleneagles.
Mr Harrison, sorry to interrupt, but in Councillor Gray, are you still in the meeting? Because having declared an interest, you should drop out and then join back in. I can see the picture there. I can see that maybe in the meeting, although I'm not hearing anything.
I think Councillor Gray is leaving according to the...
He's gone now, that's fine. Sorry, just have to make sure the procedure's followed. Sorry, Mr Harrison.
No, thank you. As I say, this is a site which is around 250 metres from Gleneagles House, a Category B listed building. Vargate Cottage is adjacent to the site. The site extends to around 145 metres long by 50 metres wide. It is partly bounded to the west by a stone wall. The other boundaries are largely defined by post and wire fencing and associated planting. The southern part of the site comprises an area of grass and some trees, including a row of Irish yew trees. An area of woodland forms the eastern or northern part of the site. It contains some demolition material from the house that was previously located on the site. Access is via the existing estate road from the A823. This access is also part of the core path. Although this is an in-principle application, an indicative plan of the house position and landscaping layout has been submitted, and there is considerable information in relation to flooding and biodiversity as well. I'll try and take you through the photographs now, but you might like to page 39 onwards, which provides you with a location plan. The general sequence of the photographs is, first of all, Gleneagles House itself and the park plan setting of the house, approaching the site excuse me, from the east, and then the more open portion of the site, and then the wooded portion of the site. So I say in the first photograph here, we have Gleneagles House itself, And you can see we're looking across basically an area of parkland towards the house and what would appear to be the hedge which enclosed the immediate area of gardening ground associated with the house. In the next photograph, swinging round to the right of that, we're looking across the central area of that parkland between Gleneagles House and the site.
Mr. Harrison, sorry to interrupt, but it appears one councillor cannot see the photographs. We need to pause until that's kind of rectified, hopefully.
Is that just me, or is...
I can see them fine.
I can see the photographs. Yep.
Oh, I can only see Audrey. I could get the ones that were sent and follow them along on my, so I just have to get them.
They are the same ones, so you could do that, yes.
But Danny says he's having a similar issue.
Yes.
Councillor Purvis, could I ask if you could leave and rejoin the meeting to see if that improves things for you, please?
Okay, I'll do that. Thanks.
Danny, could you try the same for me?
Yeah, no problem, Chris.
I can see the photos now. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you, Councillor.
Would you like me to continue, convener?
Yes.
Thank you. This is the second photograph we're looking at, just to be clear, and it's entitled Parkland. So we're looking across the central area of parkland between Gleneagles House and the application site. In the next photograph, we move slightly again to the right-hand side, looking across the remainder of the parkland, and you can only maybe just barely make it out, but Cottage is the white dot you see identified by the yellow arrow in that photograph. But of course, you'll see that in more detail later on. Moving on from that, we now move on to the access road to the application site, looking across, as it were, the entirety of the parkland we've seen in the earlier photographs, again to the frontage of Gleneagles House itself. Moving on from that photograph, we look down the access road towards the application site, which is obviously indicated with the red line here. Moving on a little from that photograph, we're now looking at the eastern boundary of the application site, and as you can see, that's a well-wooded edge to the application site. Moving on from that, we go further up the access road, effectively next to the junction with Vargate Cottage here, and we're looking along the southern boundary of the access road and the application site. And this next photographs will swing slightly to the left of that. This is us now looking at the, shall we say, the southern aspect of the application site, what was almost certainly the former garden ground associated with the farm house. And you can see the row of yew trees, which you'll see in a later photograph there. Moving on to the next photograph, we see the gable of Vargate Cottage, and we're now looking down the access, the farm track as it were, which forms the boundary on the western side of the application site. And as we swing slightly to the left of that photograph, in the next photograph, we see the frontage of Vargate Cottage itself. And as we can probably interpret from that, there appears to be an original building that's almost certainly been extended with a more modern porch and possibly an extension on the far side too. Swinging back to the right of that photograph, we now look in a little more detail at the garden area associated with the former farmhouse, and you can see the line of yew trees, which has been referred to by the applicant, and also the wall, which is referred to by the applicant. And in the next photograph, we just see a little bit more of a detail of that wall. Moving on from that photograph, we now see the area which appears to have some of the building remains from the former farmhouse, now substantially overgrown. And then swinging slightly to the left of that, Again, we're catching the corner of some of those remains, but we're now looking towards the woodland to the rear of the former farmhouse. And moving on from that into that woodland in the next photograph, you can see there's a variety of planting. There's some, for example, some deciduous planting here. I think it's principally cherry, but you can probably pick up the fact that there are a number of, shall we say, planting tubes in history here. So the site seems to have been planted up at some point in the past. So moving on from that photograph, again, a certain amount of evidence in this case of planting, but in this case, conifer planting. And moving on again to the next photograph, we've got a little bit of a mix of, I say, planting in tubes, but also a very mature sycamore in that particular instance at the northern end. So we now step out of the application site into the track, and this, I say, is that western boundary of that northern wooded area of the application site, looking back towards the access road where we came in. And if we swing round behind us and look down the rest of that access road, there's obviously mature conifer planting and a way leave you can see in that photograph as well. So I'll leave you the final photograph then, which shows the application site from that, or at least the southern area of that. Turning first of all in summary to the applicant's case, a similar application was withdrawn and the proposal resubmitted with additional supporting information, which is seen as addressing the planning officer's original concerns regarding flood risk and the lack of tree and biodiversity surveys, as required by Local Development Plan Policies 40 and 41. A house stood on the site until about 25 years ago, and its remains are still present. The site is seen as having a long-established site boundaries and a strong landscape framework on all sides. Its development would be sympathetic to the landform and trees and the neighbouring cottage without any detrimental impact on the surrounding landscape. As such, the proposal also accords with the detailed siting criteria as set out through the local plan. Even if the site fails to be accepted as a proposal supported by Policy 19 Part 4 of Local Development Plan 2 and Category 4 of the Supplementary Guidance as a replacement house, it is considered that the site complies with Policy 19 Part 6 of the Local Development Plan 2 and Category 6 of the Supplementary Guidance regarding brownfield land. The land was formerly occupied by buildings, and the proposal would involve the removal of on-site dereliction and result in a significant environmental improvement. Some of the former stone could be reused in the new house or on its boundaries. It is not considered that the planning officer gave proper consideration to Category 3.1 regarding existing gardens of the policy or the associated supplementary guidance. The current supplementary guidance states, and I quote, "Proposals for a new house or houses within the original garden ground associated with an existing country or estate house will be supported, provided that there is an appropriate landscape setting and additional development will not fundamentally affect the qualities and integrities of the site, particularly where the house is a listed building or falls within a historic garden and designed landscape. A country or estate house is defined as a large house set within its own estate or extensive grounds. This section does not apply to domestic scale gardens or where gardens have been created at a later date, for example, by a change of use of agricultural land to garden ground." And that's the end of the quotation. Gleneagles House is a Category B listed building. It lies some 250 metres from the application site. While the report of handling recognises that the intervening vegetation would limit any impact on the listed building, it fails to mention that the site lies within and is associated with the larger estate property, where Policy 3.1a could be considered favourably. The site and its surrounding land is part of the wider 6,500 acre estate of Gleneagles. In interpreting the supplementary guidance, the site is seen as a garden once associated with Gleneagles House, and there is support for the proposal in that context. It is noted that if there was a house on the site, the proposal would be supported as a replacement. There are elements of Category 4 regarding replacement houses and Category 6 in brownfield land of the Local Development Plan 2 Policy 19 that are considered to add material weight in support of the proposal. In conclusion, it is considered that the proposal does comply with Category 3.1a, existing gardens of the supplementary guidance, and is broadly supported by government policy and guidance which seeks to support increasing the rural population. Turning now in summary to the Officer's report of handling, the proposal falls to be assessed against Local Development Plan Policy 19, Housing in the Countryside, and the associated supplementary guidance, notably in this case in relation to Category 3, new houses in the open countryside, on defined categories of site as set out in Section 3 of the supplementary guidance, and 4, renovation or replacement of houses, and 6, development on rural brownfield land. Turning first to Category 3 of Policy 19, new houses in the open countryside, this relates to details in and the associated guide under Section 3.1 concerning development in existing gardens. This is supportive of development in an established garden once associated with a country estate or house. However, the policy requires an existing house to be in place and any new house to be developed on a part of the garden that was once associated with the existing country house. In this case, there is no house on the site, so development as proposed would be contrary to this policy. Turning to Category 4 of Policy 19, this supports the replacement of houses subject to criteria Part 4E of the Associated Housing in the Countryside Guide specifically requires that, firstly, there is substantial visible evidence of a structure of the original building above ground level to enable its size and form to be identified. Secondly, it is located on an established site with a good landscape setting and a good fit in the landscape on a site acceptable on planning grounds. And thirdly, the site boundaries are capable of providing a suitable enclosure. It is accepted that there was previously a house on the site. However, the proposal is assessed as failing to meet criteria 1, as there is no visible evidence of the structure above ground level, which would enable its size and form to be identified on the ground. Turning to Category 6 of Policy 19, this supports development on rural brownfield land, where the site has been formerly occupied by buildings and where development would remove dereliction or result in a significant environmental improvement. In this case, the site is largely revegetated and is surrounded by trees and woodland. Consequently, the development is not considered to result in a significant environmental improvement. In conclusion, the proposal is not assessed as meeting any of the categories in Policy 19 of the Housing in the Countryside and associated countryside guidance. It is noted regarding, in addition, in relation to landscape, the site is within the Oakhill Hills Area of Special Landscape Quality. The tree report and arboricultural impact assessment submitted in relation to Local Development Policy 40B, Forestry, Woodland and Trees, envisages some 43 trees being felled to allow this development to take place. The Scottish Government woodland removal policy would require compensatory planting of at least that number of trees in the event of planning permission being granted. In addition, there is reference to natural heritage and biodiversity, and an extended Phase 1 survey report has been submitted, and this considers the impact on protected species such as bats, red squirrels and breeding birds. This presents a range of options to enhance the biodiversity of the site. to accord with the Local Development Plan Policy 41, Biodiversity, conditions requiring further surveys prior to any development and the carrying out of the recommendations in the Phase 1 survey would be required in the event of planning permission being granted. It is noted the proposal does not raise any concerns regarding access, drainage, surface water treatment, water supply or flooding that could not be addressed through suitable planning conditions or informatives, or the submission of additional information through the approval of a reserved matters stage. In this case, there are no representations. There is, however, a request for a site visit, but no request for a hearing. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison, for that presentation. Members, is there any questions we have for officers on this application for review? Councillor Wilson, you've got a question.
Yep. Thanks, Convener, and thanks, Mr. Harrison, for that summation. The Gleneagles house. This was a farm. It would appear from what you've said, Mr. Harrison, there's evidence that this was the remains of a farm and farmsteading that existed at one time that was demolished around about 25-30 years ago or thereby. Am I right in thinking that?
Yes, it appears from the information submitted that there's been a farm here, and then gradually some of the outbuildings have been removed, and then ultimately the farmhouse has been removed. You refer to 20 to 30 years ago. The suggestion in another part of the papers refers to it being demolished sometime in the late 1980s, so maybe 30 plus years ago. What we don't have any information on is, shall we say, when the farmhouse was last occupied, but say the building appears to have been there until the late 80s.
And do we know if the farm was associated with Gleneagles house, or it was a separate entity? Has any evidence been submitted to support that?
There's been no, shall we say, you might say, direct evidence to say it was, but certainly the comment in relation to the site being part of the wider 6,000 odd acre Gleneagles estate would certainly seem to suggest that it was part of that broader estate. Okay, and just zoning in on the house again and the garden grounds, has the applicant submitted any evidence to support the claim that this was part of the garden ground of the estate? Because it would appear that if it was part of the farmsteading, that might not necessarily have been garden ground. Well, the most, shall we say, it's a matter maybe for you to interpret, but there certainly would seem to be a significant, and everyone recognises a significant physical separation between the, shall we say, Gleneagles house itself and what would appear to be an independent unit, somewhat separated from it, both historically in terms of this being a farm with a farmhouse and what would appear to be garden ground associated with the farmhouse on the southern side of the house, and then outbuildings and a yard potentially to the rear of on the northern side of the farmhouse. So there appear to be a separate unit there in comparison to the main Gleneagles house, which would appear to be its own domestic garden ground.
Okay, and the small cottage which you drew attention to quite clearly, Vargate Cottage, do we know, I mean, it looks like a stone built cottage that's had extensions added to it and whitewash applied to the walls. Would it be reasonable to think that that may have been a bothy or a cotter house for the farm at one time?
It seems quite possible that there was, as you say, a secondary dwelling there in some form, and quite possibly in relation to the separately named farm, yes.
Okay, and finally, Mr. Harrison, Gleneagles house is I think I'm right, I think 250 metres away?
It's of the order of 250 metres, yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Councillor Purvis, you got any questions?
Thank you, Convener. I think Councillor Wilson has clarified most of the points that I would want to ask around the garden. Just simply to clarify again, the policy that is referred to, it talks about garden ground rather than a general estate. It's not just the estate of the house, it's the garden ground specifically. I presume there's still a value judgment in that, in how we assess the application.
Yes, inevitably it does come down to, as you say, a judgment in each case. But yes, the reference is specifically to garden ground, which you may have a, shall we say, a large country house which may only have its own garden ground. It may not necessarily have a whole estate associated with it. So there's not an assumption you must have an estate as well. It's really just focusing on the garden ground aspect.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Harrison, just one question. We saw pictures of which would have been could have been stone from either a house or outbuildings, but there's no pictures showing the stones giving any outline of the buildings. It looks as if they've been piled up in a part of the field or garden. Is that correct?
Yes, it was difficult, to be quite candid. It was difficult to take a photograph which really illustrated the demolition material, because, as you say, it seems a combination of a mound of material and then maybe one or two, and the applicant has put some photographs in themselves, of course, one or two areas where there is the remains of stonework and demolition material. So in terms of shall we say, some degree of walls standing, there is certainly no obvious evidence of an outline or a footprint of a building as such.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison. Thank you for that. If that's all the questions, members, can we proceed to determine the application for review based on the information that is before us, that is, information contained in the papers and the presentation by the planning advisor? Happy to proceed?
Yes, I think we've got sufficient information, Convener.
Councillor Purvis, happy to proceed?
Yeah, happy to proceed, Convener. Thank you.
Right, I will start the debate on this item. There's been quite a lot of information here, and I've been through it quite well throughout the weekend. I've looked over it and tried to suss out exactly what is going on in this appeal. Mention of, first of all, 3 new houses in open countryside, part of the original garden ground. I'm not convinced that it's part of the grounds. I'm not convinced that it's part of the garden grounds relating to Gleneagles House, definitely. And so therefore I minded that that is not a good enough reason. Then we move on to the renovation replacement of houses, item 4. To me, there's no clear evidence of the building outline and their location in that area, so that gives me a concern that that wouldn't be a justification to overturn this. And when it gets to rural brownfield land, well, the land's actually returned to its natural state on this site, so therefore it falls on that one as well. So I am minded to reject this appeal and uphold the officer's decisions on this one. I'll move now to Councillor Wilson for his.
Thanks, Convener. I won't reiterate the points you've made. I think the crucial thing for me is deciding if, in terms of the LDP2 policy, that this site is part of the garden ground of Gleneagles House. That for me is quite crucial, and I think that the applicant has not demonstrated to us in evidential terms that this site was part of garden ground associated with Gleneagles House. It may well have been part of the estate, and it may well still be part of the estate, but it's also clear, convener, that the site was part of a farm and farmsteading and farmhouse, and therefore, if it was that complex of buildings, it could not, by definition, have been part of the garden ground of Gleneagles House. It was an adjacent farm that may have been part of the estate at one time. I think the policy, if this had been within a walled garden associated with the house close by, but the 250 metres distance and the previous function of it as a farm would lead me to indicate that or to conclude that it's not part of the garden ground and therefore would not comply with the policy. And I would agree with your summation.
Thank you. Councillor Purvis.
Thank you, convener. On this occasion, I think all three of us are in agreement. I would just echo the comments that both you and Councillor Wilson have made. I don't think it fits within any of the criteria of policy 19, and I think that that is the right policy that it has been refused under. It isn't a replacement house because there isn't anything there at this moment in time. I don't think it classifies as a brownfield site given what has happened since the house that might have been there 25 or 30 years ago has been removed, and I certainly don't think that it, under the LDP2 supplementary guidance, classifies as being within the garden ground of the country house. It might well be on a wider estate and as part of a farm, as Councillor Wilson has indicated, but doesn't fall under the specific criterion that is in this policy. So on those grounds, I'm happy to concur with my two colleagues and support the refusal of the application and decline the appeal. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Purvis. Yes, it's a unanimous decision then that we will uphold the decision of the officers to refuse this, and I'll move over to Mr. Elliott if he wants any further details before we finish this one.
Thank you, convener. Could I take members to page 37 of your papers, which is the original decision notice by the appointed officer, and you have ground one there. Now, you will have to make one change because in the interim, since that decision was made, the Housing and Countryside Guide 2012 has been superseded. It will now need to be changed to the, as we've been talking about, Housing in the Countryside Supplementary Guidance, and in brackets 2020. So sort of lines 2 and 3, that will need to change. My only other query is the ground of refusal simply lists the categories but doesn't explain why. My query is whether you want to put a why in at the end. Councillors have concentrated, at least my understanding, on the garden ground aspect, so you could be supplementing that particular part.
Yes, as far as I'm concerned, the garden ground doesn't relate to Gleneagles House, which is, I think, what the applicant has been referring to. Yes,
my query, convener, is whether you want to say it is not part of the garden ground or whether it's not been demonstrated that it's been part of the garden ground.
It's not been demonstrated to be part of the garden ground.
So would members be content with, in particular, at the very end of that ground of refusal, you'd add in something along the lines of, in particular, it has not been demonstrated the site is part of the original garden ground associated with Gleneagles House? Would you be content?
Everyone else is happy with that. I'm happy with that.
I'm content with that, convener.
Okay.
Yes, I too am content.
Thank you, Convener.
Councillor Elliott is still there?
Yes, sorry, I said thank you, Convener. I was just that's sufficient for my purposes.
Okay, so that's us finished with that one then. So we'll move on to item 4.2, which is in the Castle Gowrie, and it's land 30 metres east of Castle Wind in Fawns Holdings, West Kinfawns. And Mr. Harrison, I'll ask you to do the presentation on this item. Oh, wait,
Convener, we need to get Councillor Gray back in.
We need to get Councillor Gray back in. Sorry.
I will wait his arrival and then I'll make my departure just to make sure he arrives safely, if that's okay with you, Convener.
Right, thank you.
I don't want to overstay my welcome, but I'd like to see.
It was a don't panic
Councillor
moment there.
has entered the meeting now.
Is it okay? I will take my leave of you. Thank you. Bye for now.
Councillor Gray, welcome to the meeting.
Thank you.
Right, we're now going to get Mr. Harrison to proceed with the item 2, which is land 30 metres east of Castle Wine, Kinfawns Holdings, West Kinfawns.
Thank you, Convener. This is a detailed planning application for the erection of a place of worship under Class 10 and the associated works at land 30 metres east of Castle Wind, Kinfawns Holdings, Kinfawns. The application site extends to some 0.35 hectares and access is from Castle Wind. The land is currently in agricultural use for grazing. The proposal is for a single-storey timber building. Externally, it would have timber cladding and the roof would be clad in grey metal profiled metal sheeting. The accommodation would provide for a maximum of 50 people. It's anticipated that the building would only be used for 3 hour-long services per week, and these would not involve any amplified music. Parking would be provided for 29 vehicles, and this would be at a level set below the building. The surrounding space would be landscaped. I'll just take you through the photographs now, but you might like to page 403 onwards, which will provide you with the location plan and site plan, and of course plans of the proposed church. The general sequence of the photographs will be, first of all, on the A90 and approaching from the east, the site itself, and then views from the west. So I say in the first photograph, this is us up on the junction with the A90, and the site is indicated as, shall we say, behind the trees which front onto the road at that particular point. And you'll see Canoe Hill rising, the wooded slopes of Canoe Hill, that is, rising on the right-hand side of the photograph. Canoe Hill will also appear in later photographs. So if we swing slightly to the left of that photograph, we still catching the main road, but again you see the remainder of the screening, as it were, as it stands at the moment. And as you can probably make out, the screen is only, shall we say, 1 or 2 trees deep at that point. You can see the field beyond. Moving on from that, we now move down into Castle Wind and look across the application site. And as you'll see, the application site effectively divides that corner of the open space, which is referred to in the local development plan. And you can see the adjoining house there, as well as the rising wooded ground of Canoe Hill. If we swing slightly to the right of that photograph, we see the area of open space which is out with the application site. That's the, shall we say, the triangular corner neck closest to the junction. And you can of course make out some traffic on the A90 as well. Swinging slightly to the left of that photograph, we catch the application site, the screen planting adjacent to the road, and the rising ground of Canoe Hill. Swinging slightly to the left of that photograph again, catch the remainder of the application site, and of course the adjoining house, and beyond that a further bungalow. Let's say this clearly shows Canoe Hill and the tower. On the next photograph, we're now looking down the western boundary of the application site, and you'll see there's a strip of ground which is separated from the application site and the stone wall which forms the boundary of the actual field with the bungalow at that particular point. We swing slightly to the left of that photograph and step back down the road. This is us now looking along the site frontage indicated in red, and we catch the bungalow which is adjacent to the application site. And again, this is just to give you an indication of the background, the woodland and the landscape context of the application site. So if I just leave you with the last photograph of the application site itself. Turning first of all, in summary to the applicant's case, the proposed hall building is seen as being of a modest scale and simple form. The proposal would provide a wider benefit to the community of Kinfons, as well as meeting the Trust's ambitions for a Brethren Hall in this locality as a satellite to their main church at Bridge of Erne. Their other 3 churches in the Perth area have not raised noise complaints in the past. Regarding the first reason for refusal concerning policy 1A placemaking, the proposal is not considered to be detrimental to the setting or character of Kinfons in terms of its setting or design. It is noted that the planning officer does not raise concerns regarding the design of the building. Turning to the second reason for refusal concerning policy 14A, open space, retention and provision, the development is not seen as resulting in a significant loss of open space, as the site only occupies half of the open space designation in the local development plan. The building itself only occupies some 10% of the site. The rest of the application site would be landscaped to the benefit of the edge of the settlement. The applicants own the woodland to the north and east and the other half of the open space designation. The management of the land would be undertaken in association with the development to maintain the buffer with the A90 and the setting of the village. Regarding the third reason for refusal, that's in relation to policy 39, landscape, the proposal is not seen as being detrimental to the landscape setting of Canoe Hill or as reducing the landscape buffer between the A90 and the settlement. The modest scale and massing of the building, the pattern of development, is also seen as reflecting the housing of the adjoining settlement, and the proposed landscaping would enhance the setting of Canoe Hill. In this context, it's noted that the Council has previously indicated that this, and I quote, area of land is not exceptional for any use, recreational or scenic, end of quotation, in the context of the local plan assessment. Turning to the fourth reason for refusal concerning policy 1660B, new development proposals, this proposal seeks to provide a facility for local residents and it's expected to draw a congregation, not expected to draw a congregation from a wider area. It's anticipated that almost 50% of the visitors would be expected to travel by foot or cycle. The parking that is being provided is there to meet the Council's standards and is not expected to be fully required. In conclusion, the proposal is seen as complying with all the local development plan 2 policies and that are cited in the reasons for refusal. Turning now in summary to the officer's report of handling. The site is located within the settlement boundary of Kinfons. In residential areas such as this, community facilities are generally supported. However, the site is specifically designated as open space under policy 14, which presumes against development. The site is considered to have visual amenity value, defining the settlement edge and providing separation with the dual carriageway. The designation of this site was revisited during the recent local development plan examination, when the Council stated, and I quote, "Open space is not simply about providing usable areas for recreation. It can also be an area of green space that provides breathing space between urban areas, creating landscape settings for settlement edges. In this case, whilst the area of land is not exceptional for any specific use, recreational or scenic value, it does provide a buffer between the busy dual carriageway and the quiet back road that leads through Kinfons. Removal of this designation, whilst retaining it in the settlement boundary, would mean that development of this site could take place. The development of this area would create a new more urban entrance off the busy road, changing the visual entrance to the settlement. Furthermore, this site is located so close to the A90 that noise pollution could be an issue. End of quotation. The reporter agreed with this view and the designation remained in the plan. The proposal would take up almost half of the open space area, with parking being dominant at the entrance to the settlement. While Policy 14 would allow for the development of a minor part of the site, this proposal concerns a significant area of the allocation. This is seen as changing the open character of the land and having an adverse impact on visual amenity and the landscape buffer between the A90 trunk roads and Kinfons. Turning to Policy 60, Transport Standards and Accessibility Requirements for new development proposals. This aims to ensure that uses that involve significant travel generation are easily accessible by walking, cycling and public transport to reduce travel demand by car. The capacity to accommodate 50 people could be considered significant for Kinfons. The accessibility of this site cannot be described as good, other than for those living locally in Kinfons. The proposed parking provision of 29 spaces suggests that most visitors would be expected to arrive by car. The location is not considered to be sufficiently accessible by modes of transport other than private car. Considering design and layout, the proposed timber building is functional and is seen as dominated by the proposed parking provision. Regarding landscape, the site is within the Sidlaw Hills Special Landscape Area next to Canoe Hill. While there is some existing landscaping along the A90 trunk road boundary, the site is generally open. The application does not include any landscape proposals. This site is designated as open space to preserve the existing open aspect of views to Canoe Hill beyond the site. The proposal is therefore seen as contrary to Policy 39, as it does not safeguard the visual amenity of this part of Kinfons. Finally, regarding residential amenity, it is recognised that places of worship can be a source of noise disturbance to adjoining housing from traffic and music, although this could be the subject of a planning condition. Similarly, the proposal does not raise insurmountable concerns in relation to flood risk, access or drainage. In this case, there is one representation in support of the proposal. There is also a request for a site visit and no request for a hearing. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Harrison. Members, have you any questions for officers on this application for review?
No question.
Councillor Purvis?
No, I think I'm content as well. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Yeah, well, if there's no questions, we'll move on. And members, can we proceed to determine this application for review based on the information that is before us, that is information contained within the papers and the presentation by the planning advisor. Are you happy to move on with this?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Right. Councillor Purvis, do you want to start the debate on this item?
Okay, thank you, Convener. Well, having considered the information, and thank you very much for the presentation there, I think I'm minded to grant this appeal, and I'll go through the reasons for that. I don't agree with the reasons that have been given for refusal. First, placemaking. I think given the size and scale of the Gospel Hall that is proposed, I think this is similar and in keeping with the existing houses that are already on this stretch of road, and also, as has been indicated, the rest of the site would be landscaped. So I don't agree with the policy 1A as a grounds for refusal. Moving to the second grounds, which is policy 14A, which is perhaps the most contentious one. And while I do have some issues in the report with some of the figures that have been provided, I am slightly confused by the percentages that have been put forward by the appellant. Considering all of the information, I don't think that this would be an unnecessary or over-the-top use of the open space, given that the triangular wooded area, which acts as a buffer between the A90 and Kinfons, the existing settlement, I don't think this would be excessive, and even then it doesn't use the full bounds of the site. If we move on now to policy 39, the landscape, and it talks about the Canoe Hill and whether it contributes to the setting or not. I think that the palette and the materials that they suggest, and again the size and scale of the building, would not inappropriately detract from the setting of Canoe Hill. So again, I don't think that is an appropriate grounds for refusal. Then finally, on policy 60B in relation to the transport standards and accessibility requirements, while it is very difficult to estimate these things in advance, I think the fact that they suggest as many as half of people could be using active travel to get to the location is something that is quite positive. And while it would perhaps attract more cars than would be using this road previously, I don't think that's an insurmountable problem. And as has already been referenced, the various issues of flooding and other things have been addressed. So given my assessment of those policy grounds that were presented for refusal, I am minded to grant the appeal as compliant with Local Development Plan 2 2019. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Councillor Purvis. Councillor Gray, can we have your
thank you,
thoughts?
I'm slightly different here. I've got to say, on the 4 reasons, the reason 1, I'm not convinced that reason 1 is sound. Reason 2, I am convinced. I think it's a very strong reason that it's very recently been looked at again and placed as, according to the development plan in 2019, to remain as open space. On the point 3, I'm not totally convinced there either. I don't think it would have a significant detriment to the area there. But in point 4, I do strongly feel that to serve an area around Kinfons, it is a very difficult position to require cars to enter there. The only ones who could safely do it reasonably well are those coming westwards from down the cars. The remainder would have difficulty accessing this site reasonably without causing unnecessary traffic. And I do think overall the approach to off the M90, A90, whichever it is, at that point does necessitate a green space before you reach Kinfons village itself. And on balance, I think my weight is towards refusal here and not accepting this appeal.
Thank you, Councillor Gray. So it's 1-1. Right, to start off with, probably 10%, the building is 10% of the site. However, the parking area is larger, and I think it has an impact on the character and amenity of the area. So for that reason, I would find that I would be happy to uphold the officer on that one. That's my papers just fell down. There is the buffer area. If we can come to that, I passed by and had a look at it yesterday, and there is a wooded area but it's not, and you can see it by, you can see the traffic through it. It's not densely wooded buffer area. So I'm not convinced that a building there would be suitable, considering it is a buffer area. I would also like to point out that as you come in to the settlement at Confons, it still keeps its character of what it originally was, which was small holdings. It's only when you get further into it that there's been a lot of development. So to put a building on that triangle would urbanise, it would look more urban and not be as pleasing as it is at the moment. So for that reason, I would say there is an impact by the development of the prayer hall here. So I would uphold that by the officer's decision. 60B transport, yes, that would cause another opening in there. Debatable about the amount of traffic, whether it would there would be a lot of people on their cycles and walking. Certainly on a dreich day, I think there would be more traffic. So yes, I would uphold that one as well. So I will agree with Councillor Gray. So you will have a 2-1 majority to uphold the officers on this one. Mr. Elliott, do you want to get that more on that decision?
Thank you, Convener. We have a clear 2-1 majority to refuse. We have details from Councillor Purvis of his dissenting view. That's fine. However, Convener, the grounds of refusal between yourself and Councillor Gray do not appear to be quite the same, and I always ask that we consider that. It would be better for them to be the same. Now, it depends how strong you both feel about those. My understanding as to where you are is you are in partial agreement. And if I go through, I'm on page 325, 326, which are the grounds of refusal. And going through ground of refusal number 1, I don't think you were quite in agreement there. Convener, you were still looking to refuse on that, but Councillor Gray wasn't. That depends how strong you are on that. Ground of refusal 2, you did agree on. So you're quite in agreement that should be refused on that basis. Ground of refusal 3, I think there was a difference there. Councillor Gray didn't refuse on that, didn't want to refuse on that, but Councillor Convener, I think you did. I wasn't 100% clear. And then ground 4, my understanding is you are in agreement.
Yeah.
So
I would quite concede grounds, the first reasons of refusal, but on 3, remember, you're going to have a large monoblocked area as well as the prayer hall. And that's where I see the views from sort of Canoe Hill would be impacted with this car park as well as the prayer hall. I think it would be significant.
Councillor Gray, would you be prepared to agree to that, and that would put you in agreement? I'm not saying you have to, but that's a matter for yourself.
No, I would be happy to. To be honest, that is one. Was 1 and 3. I wasn't convinced on both of them, but I was prepared to suggest that I was not unconvinced. And on that 3, yep, I'll take that point.
Okay, so therefore, it's refuse. Just writing this down. Refuse on grounds. Get this right. 2, 3, and 4.
Yep.
So it wouldn't be 1. And I just want to address the terms of those and see whether you agree with the terms of those. I didn't hear anything to suggest you wanted to change ground of refusal number 2. It would be the same terms of that.
Correct.
Similar with ground 3, I didn't hear anything that there was need to change the terms of that.
No.
Correct, yeah.
Now ground 4, there's a slight typo on the 4th line. It should, instead of wold, it should be wood. But otherwise, are you in agreement with the terms of that?
Yes.
Yeah, happy with the spelling change. Yeah.
Yes. So by majority, refuse in terms of the original grounds of refusal 2, 3 and 4 with a slight change to ground 4. Okay. Right, thank you, Convener.
Yep.
Thank you, Convener. That suits my purposes in terms of the minutes.
Thank you. Right, we'll be on to the last item 4.3 for today, which is erection of a dwelling house and garage, land 40 metres southwest of Gateside Cottage for TVET. Mr. Harrison, will you give the presentation on this one?
Thank you, Convener. This is a detailed application for the erection of a dwelling house and garage, as you say, at 40 metres southwest of Gateside Cottage for TVET, or by for TVET. The site extends to some 4,350 square metres, that's approximately an acre. It lies next to a group of buildings in the countryside around 3 kilometres from Dunning and to the southwest of Fertiviet. A mature hedge separates the site from the cottage to the north. Hedging has been planted recently on the other boundaries with the adjoining farmland, and there is a post and wire fence along the road frontage. The site is within the Oakhill Hills Special Landscape Area and is identified as Class 2 prime agricultural land in arable use. The proposal is for a substantial 3/4 bed detached dwelling house with accommodation over 2 levels. External finishes include a mix of timber, stone and render. The property is of a modern style but traditional form with dormer windows in the roof. A detached double garage with music room in the roof space is also proposed. A gas main runs between these 2 proposed buildings. Access to the site is onto the B934 public road. Design statement submitted explains the applicant's desire to sell their farm and build this house for their retirement. The site is land in their ownership. I'll just take you through some photographs now, but you might like to page 481 onwards, which provide you with a location plan, the site plan and plans of the proposed house. The general sequence of the photographs will be approaching the site from the east, the site as seen from the west, and the site itself and its boundaries. So to take you to the first photograph, this is, is us approaching from the east, looking, across the landscape in a southerly direction. And as you can see, it's extensive, basically a relatively flat area of arable land with the hills rising beyond. And if we swing round to the right of that photograph, we take in more of the agricultural land on that corner. And first of all, reference, just for clarity, so looking in a southerly direction, there is reference to an agricultural shed in the items which were the subject of previous planning applications, and this is the agricultural shed adjacent to Gateside Cottage. The site itself is beyond the hedge, the mature hedge you see, which is associated with Gateside Cottage in that particular photograph. Swinging round to the right in the next photograph, we're still catching Gateside Cottage as we look down the road in that westerly direction, but we'll also pick up Gateside of Broom Hill. From there, if we go up the road a little bit, again we just pick up on the holding, which agricultural holding as it were, which is adjacent to Gateside Cottage there. And you can see this strip of green stretching into the landscape. I mention this because that holding is not, the boundaries of that is not identified on your location plan. Swinging round to the right of that photograph, we catch the remainder of that in Gateside Cottage, and we're just beginning to pick up the application site, as you'll see there by the red on the extreme right of the photograph. And then we swing round to the right of that photograph in the next one, again a little bit more of the application site as the road dips away, and we pick up Gateside of Broom Hill, and we're looking in a westerly direction here. Moving on a little bit from that and swinging to the left, again just a little more detail of the entry into that agricultural holding and the agricultural shed. And again, swinging around to the right of that, we get Gateside Cottage in more detail. And then from that again, we move on to the far side of Gateside Cottage, and we're now looking back across that corner of the application site, and you can see the mature hedge enclosing that boundary with Gateside Cottage. We now have other photographs of the site frontage. We move around with the main frontage as it is onto the public road, and then swinging around again to the right of that photograph, the remainder of the application site and its relationship to the adjoining farmland and some trees and the hills beyond. Swinging around to the right of that photograph again, more of the adjoining agricultural land, and then swinging around to the right of that photograph, further around to the right, we now down the slope, moving in towards the direction of Dunning. The next photographs will be as we go down that road, looking back up to the application site. So this is us looking up to Gateside of Broom Hill. And there's reference in the papers to the change of use of the agricultural buildings there to residential accommodation, and also an independent application site to the rear, as it were, the left-hand side of the buildings there, basically for an independent house. So this is us now looking back up to the application site. We're just catching, of course, the agricultural buildings on the left-hand side. You can just make out part of the gable of Gateside Cottage and the remainder of the application site. So in the next photograph, if we turn around to the right, we catch most of the application site and just a little bit of Gateside Cottage. Swinging around again to the right of the photograph there, catching the corner of the application site and then the rest of the adjoining field and some of the trees beyond. We move from there further down the road in the next photograph, down to the bridge, as it were. We're stepping back from the application site, as it were. We're down at the lowest level, looking up to the application site, and you're just picking up, of course, the cottage and the former farm buildings. Moving back again further from that, we're now well on the road, as it were, to Dunning, looking back at the application site in its broader landscape context. We move back up the road from there. In the next photograph, we now move into the application site itself, and there'll be a number of photographs which will take us, as it were, around the application site. So this is us looking at the western boundary and the recent planting which has taken place there. And if we move up from the public road, we now look along the southern boundary adjacent to the farmland. Now we swing round to the left of that photograph, look across the main body of the application site. We're beginning to pick up part of the hedge associated with the Gateside Cottage there. And if we move again to the left of that photograph, we pick up Gateside Cottage, and again, body of the application site. And then swinging around again to the left of that photograph, still get Gateside Cottage, but also picking up the main farm, steading building and the farmhouse. I'll be able to move on to the next photograph, thank you. This is now on the eastern boundary, looking, as it were, back down the application site from that far corner to Gateside Cottage and the farmhouse. And from there, as it were, if we swing to the right, we into the land which has been taken out of the field is associated part of the holding. And if we move to the next photograph, we see the whole of that boundary, that little bit of the holding we saw earlier in the far distance of Gateside. And then from that position, if we swing to the right of that, we look across the main body of the application site towards the farmland and the hills beyond. And you can see that along the line of the boundary there, the hedge planting which has taken place. And then if we swing to the right of that photograph again, looking across the body of the application site, we're now looking, as it were, in the Dunning direction towards the southwest, looking towards the entry into the application site and the landscape beyond. So if we move on from that photograph, we know, for clarity, this is the applicant's farm as it stands, and as he mentions in his papers, this is the property which would be being disposed of in association with the farmland. And then if we move on to the next photograph, I'll leave you that general photograph of the application site. Turning now to the applicant's case in summary, the proposal is considered to align with Policy 1A and 1B, placemaking and the housing in the countryside guidance. The site is seen as defining the western end of the wider building group at this locality. In addition, it would provide an attractive visual balance when viewed from the southwest approach towards what is assessed as a compact building group, including Gateside Cottage and Gateside or Broomhill Farm buildings. The site is at the same level as Gateside or Broomhill buildings and Gateside Cottage. The traditional architectural design, scale and layout of the proposal reflects the other houses in the locality. Regarding the housing in the countryside and associated supplementary guidance, the applicant contests that the proposal does and considers that the proposal does fit within a building group as set out in Policy 19 or LPD2 and the recently adopted supplementary guidance. In this context, the proposed dwelling is well building group of existing properties and the wider dispersed building group. Secondly, the proposed site is viewed as a logical addition to the dispersed building group, which extends along the northern side of the public road and the agricultural storage buildings along the southern side. The site is seen as defined by existing topography, the public road and well-established beech hedge planting and more recent planting undertaken by the applicant. Thirdly, the siting of the house adjacent to and on the same level with Gateside Cottage and the former farm buildings on the opposite side of the road. This would create the opportunity for a compact building group to form the visual balance between these properties when approaching from the southwest. In addition, the traditional building is seen as sympathetic with the surrounding traditional house types and the wider environmental context. Also, the development would protect the visual amenity of the building group when viewed within that wider. The siting of the proposed house and garage buildings has taken account of the gas pipeline safety zone. The landscape framework would become more established in time. It is recognised that the site is within the Ochil Hills Special Landscape Area. The site is seen as well established and part of the overall building group in that setting. For these reasons, the planning officer's assessment of the proposal does not comply with Policy 39 is refuted. Turning now to Policy 50 regarding prime agricultural land, this does not oppose small-scale development directly linked to rural business, including housing on prime agricultural land, providing it's compatible with all other aspects of the policy framework of the plan, and that there is no other suitable non-prime sites available, and that it does not adversely affect the viability of the agricultural unit. In this context, the applicant refutes the officer's assessment because, firstly, the applicant has explored potential sites on non-prime land, and the proposed site is seen as the most fitting in relation to the housing in the countryside supplementary guidance. Secondly, although prime agricultural land, the site has not been farmed for 5 years. In this context, the applicant is required to set aside 22 acres to lie fallow on a revolving basis. The proposed site is seen as negligible in terms of loss of prime land. Thirdly, the loss would not impact on the viability of the agricultural unit. And fifthly, the site is rural and not within a settlement, but is viewed as lying within a building group. Beyond that, the applicant's garden is not following them into farming, and therefore, would like to continue to live on the farm when they reach retirement. In conclusion, it is considered that the proposal complies with Category 1 of Local Development Plan Policy 19 and the related supplementary guidance concerning new housing in the countryside, in that it would form part of a building group and has no adverse visual impact on the wider landscape. It is also seen as consistent with Scottish planning policy aim of increasing rural population. It is therefore not seen as being contrary to policy PM1A and B, policy 39, or policy 50 of Local Development Plan 2. Turning now in summary to the officer's report of handling. As the site is out with any settlement boundary, this proposal falls to be assessed against the current Local Development Plan Policy 19 and the associated Housing in the Countryside Guide of 2020. This supports proposals for the erection of houses in the country subject to them falling into at least one of 6 potential categories. In this case, the proposal needs to be assessed against Category 1 building groups. This states that consent will be granted for houses within building groups, provided they do not detract from the residential or visual amenity of the group. Consent will be granted for houses which extend a group into definable sites formed by existing topography and/or well-established landscape features, which provide a suitable setting. A building group is defined as 3 or more buildings of a size of at least equivalent to a traditional cottage, whether they are in residential and/or business/agricultural use or nature. Small ancillary premises, such as a domestic garage or outbuildings, will not be classed as buildings for that purpose. In this case, the main building group is located on the opposite side of the public road. The proposal is for a substantial detached dwelling house on a site that is viewed as detached from that existing building group. Also, the site is not assessed as having well-established landscape features which could provide a suitable setting. In particular, the hedge that has been planted recently to enclose this part of the field is not sufficiently established. Consequently, the principal development is considered to be contrary to Local Development Plan and the Housing in the Countryside Policy number 19. The proposal has also been considered in relation to Local Development Plan Policies Placemaking 1A. This requires development to contribute positively to the built and natural environment, and Policy 1B, which requires developments to meet a range of placemaking criteria. Criteria B of Policy 1B requires proposals to respect site topography. Due to the elevated nature of the site and the positioning of the house in the centre of the plot away from the main building group, the development is viewed as being unduly prominent. This positioning is also considered to fail criteria D, which requires proposal to respect an existing building line, as the existing development at this locality is generally parallel with the road. This development faces away from the building group and, as such, is not seen as relating well to the nearby buildings. In this respect, the proposal is also considered to be contrary to Policy 1A and some of the criteria set out in 1B. The site is within the Ochil Hills Special Landscape Area, and Local Development Plan Policy 39 requires proposals, including individual developments, to demonstrate that they would be acceptable with reference to an appropriate landscape capacity study. The applicant has not been accompanied by such an assessment. The hedging that has recently been planted around the proposed site boundaries is not seen as providing a suitable setting in that landscape. The development is seen as being highly visible, particularly when approaching from the southwest. Consequently, the proposal is not seen as meeting the criteria associated with Policy 39. The site itself is prime agricultural land, Class 2. Local Development Policy 50 does not support development on prime land outside of defined settlements unless it is necessary to meet a specific established need and there is no other suitable site available on non-prime land. The proposal must also satisfy all other relevant policies of the development plan. The applicant has not demonstrated that this is the only site available for the proposed development. It is noted that there is a recent planning permission for a similar house within the adjacent building group. Whilst not within the applicant's owner, this is seen as demonstrating that there are other sites in the immediate locality. As Policy 50 seeks to protect prime land from development, the proposal is considered to be contrary to that policy. In this case, the proposal does not raise any concerns regarding access, residential servicing, flood risk or cultural heritage. There are no representations. There is, however, a request for a site visit, but no request for a hearing. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harrison. Members, is there any questions for Mr. Harrison on this, or officers on this application?
No question.
Mr. Purvis?
No questions, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you. Members, can we proceed to determine the application for review based on the information that is before us? That is information contained within the papers and the presentation by the planning advisor. We're happy to proceed.
Agreed.
Agreed.
Right. Oh, pardon me. Councillor Gray, will you take the lead on the debate for this one?
Thank you, Convener. Yep, it's an interesting one. First of all, looking at the reasons, reason one, if we look at page 490 of our papers, it's difficult to agree that the proposed house itself does not form part of a building group. That plan I'm talking about in page 490, to my mind, clearly completes a small group of the proposal completes a small group to my mind. And the issue two, reason two, as the photograph made clear, as you approach from the west, the rather brutal rear elevation of the gate side of Broomhill Farm steading is a stark introduction to the area, let's say. And the proposed house, to my mind, would present a more pleasing distraction to this rather brutal photograph. We've got a photograph on the screen here, and if you go back one or two of them, you can see that rather clearly, that it really is, which shows, one of the photographs shows both the site and the back of this building. To my mind, a more pleasing picture. Or a more pleasing scene would definitely be a house built on the other side of that road. And in fact, it wouldn't be the frontage of a house, it would be partially the gable end of a house, which is lower than the main frontage of the house. And I just see that that would be, yeah, a good distraction from this brutal elevation here we've just seen there. Sorry, gone again. You had it. Where are we?
I think it's back a bit yet.
Yeah, it's back a bit, yeah. It was there, you could see it, was just, it did show it brutally at the side of the road. And
yeah, no, it's not that one. No, it was quite a large building. There's it.
There you go. That's it. No, the other one. The other one where you can see both sides of the road. Yeah, that's the point. Now, as you come up that road there, in fact, I drove it 2 or 3 days ago, you can see that building there, and the other one is going to be no less elevation in height-wise at the other side of the road at an angle, and I mean, you can see a gable end of the small gate-side cottage thing there already, and this would be another, and I just feel it would take the eye away from that building, and I can't see anything wrong with that. The other points, point 3, that's a tricky one. I'll discuss that in a moment. Point 4, I have no doubt that the hedge and trees planted shall very quickly provide a fitting landscape setting. I have no reason to believe otherwise. I know myself that such things, trees these days go there quickly. I think we've got a better climate than we used to have for tree growing. But reason 3, that's the more tricky one. It's dependent on whether or not the development meets a specific need. Now, in this case, we've got a farmer who was born on a farm, he spent his entire life in that farm, and he wishes to retire on that farm. So in my mind, it's a perfectly reasonable desire. Whether we call it a need, that's questionable. But on the other 3 points, I think quite clearly, it's within a group. It's an improvement to the approach coming from that side there. It may not be, that was a point that was made, it's at an angle to the road. Well, just less than 3 weeks ago, we had an application down near Kinross. And one of the main points objectors made was that these 4 houses were at an angle to the road. This was completely overlooked by the officers, and the application was approved for 9 votes to 3 or to 4, I think it was. So it's a pretty superfluous argument, the thing being at an angle to the road. We have one here which isn't this big building here, and that's straight on and full frontal onto the road there, and it looks hideous. So that's 3 points I'm absolutely convinced are invalid from the council point of view. One of them, yes, is a question of, is it a justifiable need? Well, it's certainly a desire, and if that's the only reason for refusing it, I don't think that stands up, and I would be approving this application on that basis.
Thank you, Councillor Gray. Councillor Purvis.
Thank you, convener. Well, funnily enough, sorry, did someone say something? But must have been a bit of feedback. I completely agree with Councillor Gray's reasoning. I think certainly on the first ground, it is certainly in my mind a building group, although these things are, as we've discussed in previous applications, a value judgment. And I actually quite like the design of the building. And then on the final grounds as well, I agree that the landscape could be adequately dealt with through the planting and other measures that they've suggested putting in place. I think on point 3, my concern is that in relation to the prime agricultural land, there isn't a current direct link to the business from the application as it's been put before us. We don't have an assessment of alternative sites, and it hasn't been demonstrated that this is the only possible site for this development. I suppose if we consider it in the abstract, I think Councillor Gray makes a very strong case, given that the farmer has lived there all his life and wants to continue that. But the question is whether that is a planning consideration or not. I'm stalling here slightly because I think I might have maybe changed my view while we've been listening to the original debate, because I think there is a strong case for simply refusing it on that ground when all of the other reasons for refusal I do not accept seems a bit punitive. So I think on balance, while I still make those points in relation to the prime agricultural land, I think I would agree with Councillor Gray that this could be demonstrated as a need for the building. So I'm happy to agree to uphold the appeal. Councillor Anderson, you're muted.
Thank you. So you're going with the, I didn't quite catch at the end. Are you going with the officer? Or are you going with the?
No, I'm agreeing with Councillor Gray to uphold
going with
appeal and decline the refusal.
Yeah. Well, that means it will be a 2-1 because I've looked at this and I agree with Councillor Gray's remarks around the building group. Yeah, you possibly could call it a building group, but I don't agree with him about the ugly looking building on the other side of the road, the old shed or whatever it is. I don't think 2 prominent buildings makes a good planning decision, to be quite honest. But the topography of the land means that this development, if we granted it, would be very prominent, and I wouldn't accept that in my view. Also, prime agricultural land, there has been no assessment on that. So as well as that, these 2 fall for me, and that would be one of the reasons that I would dissent from the other 2 members and uphold the officer's decision. Mr. Elliott, you'll perhaps want to have a few comments about how this is going.
Thank you, Convener. I do have to obtain clarification. First of all, Convener, on your own position, it's a dissenting view, of course. I just want to be absolutely clear, there are 4 grounds of refusal. Are you kind of got there in the end, I think, but are you agreeing with all 4 grounds? You upholding all 4 grounds?
No, the first ground, the building group, I would agree that this is this could be classed as a building group.
Okay. What about ground 2?
The elevated position would make it would be dominant.
So you would be refusing on that?
Yeah, I would refuse on that. And because there's no assessment, I would be refusing it on policy 50, prime agricultural land.
Yeah. And the last ground, Convener?
Demonstrate to say, well, again, because of the assessment, the landscape capacity hasn't been, so I would agree with that one as well.
Okay, so it would be refuse on 2, 3 and 4.
Yeah.
Now, coming back to the majority, there's one clarification I need in particular. We'll come on to conditions in a second. I'll bring Mr. Harrison in. But from what I heard Councillor Gray and Councillor Purvis say, sorry, I've lost my place on the decision notice. Sorry, here we go. Now, my concerns relate to what you said on ground 3, but I'll come to that. But basically, as I understand it, both Councillor Purvis and Councillor Gray, you're agreeing that the proposal accords with the development plan in terms of what was ground refusal 1. You do think it complies with policy 19 in the housing and countryside supplementary guidance. Same with placemaking. You think that accords with the plan, and also although there's no landscape study, your view is that it essentially accords with the land, or rather, I want to clarify again. Easier one in policy 39, there isn't a landscape study. Are you saying it accords with the plan in relation to policy 39, or are you saying it's justified because of the proposal before you, the details of the proposal?
I think the detail of the proposal being a fence line, a permanent fence line, a hedge and a tree planting exercise which would meet a landscape requirement in due course, without any question of doubt.
Okay. Councillor Purvis, you in agreement with that?
Yes, I think I would agree that the latter wording that you proposed is more in line with the reasoning for granting approval for this application that we both articulated.
So strictly speaking, doesn't accord, but there are reasons as to why you would be granting it.
On this specific ground.
On that specific number 4, yes. But the one I want to clarify in particular is policy 50, prime agricultural land, as to the reasoning you're providing. And I want to kind of refer to policy 50 because it's got quite a few elements to it. Development on prime agricultural land will not be permitted unless it is necessary to meet a specific established need, such as a major infrastructure proposal, and only when there is no other suitable site available on non-prime land. And it goes on to say, small-scale development directly linked to rural business, including housing, may also be acceptable on prime agricultural land, providing it is compatible with all other aspects of the policy framework of the plan, and there are no other suitable non-prime land sites available, and it does not adversely affect the viability of their agricultural unit. There's quite a lot in that, and my concerns, councillors, is to whether it has been demonstrated, whether you're saying it accords with the plan, or whether you're saying it doesn't accord with the plan because you've not had an assessment of other sites and the viability of the agricultural unit, but you feel there's justification for it, and it's that same sort of process I want to tease out here.
Right. Could I suggest, because I certainly consider it part of a building group, that in itself is a strong starter. It is because of the other 3, 1, 2 and 4 reasons that we agree with, or that I agree with anyway, speaking for myself only here, Callum, these are reasons to locate it in that position, and that in itself would justify the prime agricultural land element of the argument.
Councillor Gray, kind of bound to say that, of course, they kind of are independent policies. I mean, it's again, I'm referring back to the terms of the policy, but that's as far as I'll go. Councillor Purvis, do you have any comment?
Well, I think that there's 2 options really. The overriding reason for saying it complies with this, or indeed we're able to approve it, is because of the proximity to the farmer's existing farm. And I suppose you could argue. I don't know whether Councillor Gray would agree with this, that it isn't really possible if the farmer wants to retire on his farm, then the only place that he can do that is in close proximity to that. So in that regard, there isn't really anywhere else that could be done. And if you're saying that's not an acceptable justification to argue that it complies with the policy, then I suppose we would have to go for your latter wording, that we are happy to deviate slightly from the policy on this specific ground because of those reasons.
Well, I think Councillor Purvis and Councillor Gray, the difficulty with using the farmer's need is that is his future need in terms of retirement, rather than a need in terms of the existing rural business. So it's a personal need rather than one to do with the business. So I have concerns there about using that, in terms of the policy. So I think really you would be saying that although it's contrary to policy, because of the details of it, that it's justified in this circumstance.
I think we'll have to go with that wording then, assuming Councillor Gray is in agreement.
Yep.
Okay. So that's in terms of the refusal. Obviously, we'll tidy that up. Sorry, not a refusal then in terms of the grant. But I want to turn over to Mr. Harrison because, of course, a decision notice has to be issued with conditions that will have to go on it, and whether he has any questions or comments for you on conditions. I think, to be clear, it would be grant subject to suitable conditions and informatives and terms, there are potential contributions to be made here as well. So that would have to be sorted out. Mr. Harrison, do you have any comment?
Mr. Harrison, I think you're muted.
As I was saying, there's a requirement for a contribution both in relation to education and transport infrastructure prior to the decision notice being issued. But turning to the actual decision notice, as I think I mentioned, the extensive, there are proposals, of course, for both the garage and the house. Whether or not you'd wish to have any control over permitted development rights does sort of raise itself as a possible, and I stress possible, matter for you to consider. Second question is the drawings imply that a natural slate is to be used, judging by its general nature and the reference to other traditional materials, but it's not actually specified, so you might want to decide whether or not you think that should or shouldn't be subject of a condition in relation to other materials or samples being included. There's a need for further details in relation to the access and in relation to drainage. I know you made reference, particularly I think Councillor Gray, to the prospect of the fit in the landscape improving, if I can put it that way, as things become more established. Whether you require any further information on landscaping in a broader context, in addition to what's been undertaken, would be for a matter for you to consider, presumably particularly in relation to boundaries. And in relation to informatives, there would be a need for an informative in relation to water supply, and also in relation to the wood burning stove. That's the only notes I've got in the prospect of a decision notice to grant.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison. Mr. Elliott, are you happy with these?
It's more whether the both councillors, Purvis and Gray, are content with them. Mr. Harrison in particular was wondering whether there was any comment from members on the removal of permitted development rights. So I think it's for the members to indicate, or whether they're just content to leave it to conditions to be worked out.
Conditions to be worked out on that one, but I do think that the slates and the road, the road access thing needs to be sorted out with the council. That was a part of the application or the agreement made initially. Should it be made? And the slate roof, I would be keen to see that retained because it does. That's the pattern in the locality.
Councillor Purvis.
Councillor Purvis, you might be muted.
Maybe, yes, I am, sorry. Whoops. Yes, I'm happy to agree to the conditions that have been set out, and I think that in relation to permitted development, if that's something that could be considered as part of the conditions, but I wouldn't want to say anything specifically now.
Okay, sorry, Mr. Harrison, are you content with that?
I've got nothing further to add, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Is that, are you completed now, Mr. Elliott, with your?
Yes, that's by 2-1 majority. That is an approval, and it will be granted subject to suitable conditions, informatives and terms, which means the contributions, of course, with yourself giving the dissenting view.
Thank you. And that is this Local review body meeting completed. Thank you all very much for attending, and we'll say goodbye to you all.